when discussing the differences between the Theravada Buddhist tradition and the Mahayana tradition, some may see them as two entirely different religions. But it's kind of important, I think, to first of all look at the divisions of religions. We can see that religions often start out as cults, not a bad thing necessarily, unless it's a bad leader. So we could look at Jesus or Muhammad or the Buddha or Confucius gathering a small community and then teaching, and then their word spreads, disagreements arise, and different sects emerge. And then out of the sects, collections of them may band together to create divisions in a religion, like Protestantism, Catholicism, or Orthodoxy in Christianity, or Shiite, Sunni, and Sufi in Islam. And in Buddhism, Theravada and Mahayana, and the third turning Vajrayana, can be considered as divisions within which are many sects or denominations. So when we look at the similarities, that's pretty easy. They're both referencing the Buddha. They both adhere to the ideals of the Four Noble Truths, the doctrine of no self for existence, all of the 18 fields and their senses and sense objects. So many things are built into both of them that they share, that they really are the same religion. By analogy, for those raised in the Christian West, we might ask if the historical Jesus, who modern scholarship presents him as a wandering Galilean mystical prophet, if he were to meet the cosmic Christ depicted in Orthodox cathedrals, the creator of the entire universe, he might not recognize himself in that. But if he were to delve more deeply, he would find all the basic elements are there from the original doctrines. And the same is true for the Buddha encountering a cosmic Mahayana Buddha like Amitabha, for example. That points to maybe one first big difference. For the Theravada, there is only one Buddha. I remember asking a Sri Lankan Theravadan about this, and he said, there was only one Buddha, not many, not everybody can be a Buddha. And so he didn't consider Mahayana to be a true Buddhism, but for him it was a Buddhism. Of course, the other big difference, even though the idea of the Bodhisattva, someone who aspires to enlightenment, exists in the Pali language and the Theravada tradition, the Bodhisattva ideal as it emerges in the Mahayana is vastly expanded to the point where the Bodhisattva is looking like a here and now, this worldly savior of other beings, something the Theravada denied is possible, and the historical Buddha denied this as well. But the Bodhisattva of Mahayana doesn't save you. You have to connect to it, and then its vast consciousness, or that of a cosmic Buddha like Amitabha, doesn't save you. You connect with it. We can see again in the Theravada the individual emphasis. It's just my path. But in the Mahayana, we see the idea of a collective consciousness, not only of communities where we can get state Buddhism of Korea and the like. In the Mahayana literature, in fact, there are 3 vehicles in the Lotus Sutra mentioned, and the Shravaka vehicle is compared to a deer-pulled cart, because the Shravaka, the common believer, listens to the monks and teachings of the Buddha, and maybe in the next life they'll be reborn as a monk. The Pratyeka Buddhayana, or the private individual's vehicle, refers to the idea that really anyone, even a non-Buddhist, could awaken on their own without any teachers at all. A private Buddha, it's also called. And the Mahayana compares itself to a bullock cart. The Pratyeka Buddhayana is compared to a goat cart because goats go their own way. They're not so obedient as the bullock cart, and that is the comparison the Mahayana uses for itself. The mighty bullock can pull a cart with more people on it because it's stronger. And that is why it is a great vehicle, a Mahayana, rather than focusing on the doctrines of the elders, the Theravada. But even the entire cosmos is said by some Mahayana traditions to be a mutually reflective, holographic mirror universe where all consciousness reflects all consciousness. So Theravada is called Hinayana. It's a pejorative term. Don't use it with the Theravada. It means smaller vehicle. Really has the idea of lesser scope. So the Mahayana seeks a vastly more expanded universe, relatively speaking. Certainly, again, the Theravada is primarily for monks, but here in Thailand, certainly all the Buddhists feel like they're Buddhists and part of the tradition, even though the Buddha intended his doctrine and discipline for single males in the beginning, but even he liberalized and expanded his tradition to women. And the Mahayana really looks at not what the Buddha said, but focuses more on what he said about examining your own experience and changing the teachings in accord with changing times, which is also something the Buddha taught. So for Buddhism, there's no strict orthodoxy where you have to believe A, B, and C, and D things to be a true Buddhist. In fact, I like to point out in Thailand, the town drunk, gambling, cheating, lying man will still tell you he's a Buddhist. So for the Mahayana, there's a vastly expanded role for the lay person as well as for women. And in fact, the Bhikshuni Sangha, or the order of nuns, has died out in the Theravada countries, while it lives on strongly in Chinese Mahayana and less strongly in the Tibetan tradition. Finally, we can look at the big issues, the more subtle ones. Theravada relies on the Pali language, Mahayana, the Sanskrit language. For the Theravada, the no-self of the individual, the Anatman, that's the end of the line. When you realize that, you're finished and you are an arhat who has cut off all passion and will then attain nirvana, the snuffing of the ego self. For the Mahayana, your journey is not finished, however. They believe in the no-self of all phenomena, shunyata, or zeroness, commonly inaccurately translated as emptiness. It's not a negative state like being empty. It's more like zeroness, as zero is in the middle way, the Buddhist term of the integer system with its positive and negative integers. A hollow core sits at the middle of all numbers. So Anatman, they both accept. Shunyata is there again in Theravada, but in an undeveloped way compared to the Mahayana. And then finally in the Mahayana, there's a doctrine that's somewhat similar to grace. We see in the Pure Land Mahayana tradition, the most popular one arguably in terms of numbers, it's the favorite of Chinese peasants, Japanese, Korean peasants, and is called the Peasant's Way. And in that tradition, you can call on Amitabha to summon your consciousness into its pure land, which is beyond this realm we're living in, created by the consciousness of the Buddha Amitabha itself. Having once been a human being, it evolved to create a vast consciousness. And there's just nothing like that I know of in the Theravada traditions. Then finally there's the third turning of the wheel. Well, my Theravada guest speaker was quite happy to acknowledge the Mahayanists were wrong, still Buddhist. When I asked him about Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism, this Sri Lankan Theravada exclaimed, "That's not Buddhism!" And he got very angry, this very calm and otherwise complacent fellow. So some things like moving into what looks to the outsider like magic, or sometimes even is sexual union to attain awakening, these practices are considered kind of too much for both the Theravada and the Mahayana, and one may find both of the first two having big problems with the last one. So those are my thoughts. In a rough way, there's so much more to say about differences between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism.